I am writing this confession because I know my time is running out. The walls are closing in, and I can't run from the truth any longer. I have spent years standing behind a pulpit, holding a Bible in one hand, my voice ringing out with conviction, telling people about faith, about hope, about the love of God. I've told them to trust in His plan, to give freely and joyfully to His church. And they did. Oh, how they did. Week after week, they came, offering their tithes and sacrifices, believing that their hard-earned money would help further God's kingdom. They thought they were giving to God. They trusted me. I was their shepherd. But the truth? They were giving to me. Every dollar, every sacrifice, every broken prayer whispered at the altar. It fed my greed, my desires. And now, as I sit here, writing this confession, I can feel the weight of it all crushing me. The lies, the deception, the manipulation, all of it. When I was a child, I remember sitting in the front pew of the small church my family attended. I remember the way Pastor William's voice seemed to fill the room, the way he commanded attention with just his words. Even as a young boy, I was drawn to it, the power, the influence. People hung on every word he said, as though he spoke directly from God Himself. It wasn't long before I started thinking that I could be like him. That one day, I could be the man standing up there, guiding people, having them look up to me with the same reverence. What I didn't realize back then was that the pulpit is a dangerous place for someone like me. It gives too much power, too much control over the lives of others. And it gives a man like me too many opportunities to abuse it. I didn't grow up wealthy. My parents struggled to make ends meet, and I learned early on that money was power. Money gave you freedom. It gave you the ability to escape from the constraints of life. And I wanted that. I wanted more than what my parents had. I wanted to escape the small-town poverty I'd been born into. I wanted to be someone important. By the time I was in high school, I'd developed a talent for getting what I wanted. I learned how to charm people, how to convince them to trust me. My teachers loved me. My friends followed me. And I used that influence to get ahead, whether it was in sports, academics, or social circles. Manipulation became second nature to me, and by the time I graduated, I was practically an expert. When I felt the call to ministry, or at least when I convinced myself that I did, it seemed like the perfect fit. Here was a way to combine my talents with a career that offered respect, admiration, and yes, money. Ministry, after all, wasn't just about saving souls. It was also about building something, building a church, a community, an institution that people could trust and invest in. And I was determined to build something big. I enrolled in a seminary, and that's where I learned the art of preaching. It wasn't just about the message, it was about delivery. The way you spoke, the way you moved, the way you made people feel like they were a part of something bigger than themselves. I learned how to make the congregation lean in, how to make them feel the weight of my words, how to make them believe that God was speaking directly through me. And it worked. By the time I started my own church, I had already honed my craft. People flocked to my services. They hung on every word. I became the pastor I had always admired as a child, respected, trusted, revered. But then, something shifted. First, I didn't notice it. I told myself I was doing God's work, that I was bringing people to Him. But the truth was, I was bringing them to me. The church grew quickly. We went from a small rented space to a large building in just a few years. Donations poured in. People were eager to give, eager to support the mission. And that's when I first began to realize the potential. I remember the first time I took money from the offering plate. It wasn't much, just a few $100s. The church had raised more than expected that week, and I thought, why not? I deserve this. I've worked hard. No one will miss it. It was just a little extra spending money. A small reward for all my hard work. But that little taste of wealth, that little bit of power, it was intoxicating. It wasn't long before I started taking more. First, I justified it. I told myself that I was using the money to support myself and my family. After all, a pastor shouldn't live in poverty, should he? But then, it became about more than just survival. It became about luxury. I started using the money to fund vacations, to buy expensive suits, to live the kind of life I had always dreamed of. And the congregation never questioned it. They trusted me completely. When I told them that their tithes were going to support the work of the church, they believed me. They believed that their money was helping the poor, feeding the hungry, building the kingdom of God. And I let them believe it. I let them think they were doing something good, even as I used their money to satisfy my own greed. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about the power, the influence, the way people looked at me. I was more than just a pastor. I was a leader, a guide. People came to me for advice, for counsel. They trusted me with their deepest secrets, their darkest fears. And I used that trust to control them, to keep them loyal. I became addicted to the power. The money was just a means to an end. It wasn't enough to have wealth. I wanted influence. I wanted people to need me, to depend on me. And so, I started preaching more about tithing, about giving, about sacrifice. I told them that God would bless them if they gave, that their contributions were necessary to further His kingdom. And they believed me. They always believed me. But the truth was, I didn't care about their blessings. I didn't care about their spiritual growth. All I cared about was keeping the money coming in. I knew that as long as they believed in me, they would continue to give. And so, I became a master at manipulation. I learned how to pull the right strings, how to say the right things to keep them hooked. And it worked. For years, it worked. But then Sarah came along. Sarah was different. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't easily swayed by my words. She wasn't impressed by my suits or my sermons. She wanted proof. She wanted to see where the money was going, to understand how the church was using the donations. At first, I thought I could handle her. I had dealt with skeptics before. I knew how to smooth things over, how to reassure people without giving them real answers. But Sarah was persistent. She kept asking questions, kept digging. And the more she dug, the more I started to feel the walls closing in. I tried to distract her, to give her more responsibilities in the church, hoping that would keep her occupied. But it only made her more determined. I knew it was only a matter of time before she uncovered the truth. And that terrified me. I started to unravel. The guilt that I had buried for so long began to rise to the surface. Every time I stood behind the pulpit, I felt like a fraud. Every time I looked into the eyes of my congregation, I saw the trust they had placed in me, and I knew I was betraying them. But I couldn't stop. By that point, I was in too deep. The money, the lifestyle, it had become a part of me. I didn't know how to live without it. I didn't know how to be a pastor without the lies, without the deception. And so I continued. I continued to lie, to manipulate, to take. Even as the guilt consumed me, even as I felt the weight of my sins pressing down on me, I couldn't stop. I was trapped. Trapped by my own greed, my own desires. And now here I am, confessing it all. Because I can't live with the lies anymore. I can't keep pretending that I'm something I'm not. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if my congregation will forgive me. I don't know if God will forgive me. But I know I have to come clean. I know I have to face the consequences of my actions. The deeper I fell into the pit of greed, the more I began to rationalize my actions. Isn't it funny how the mind can twist things to fit its narrative? I told myself that every great leader in history had their flaws, and perhaps mine was just a hunger for the finer things. After all, I wasn't harming anyone, was I? I was preaching God's word, helping people find salvation, and guiding them on the path of righteousness. Shouldn't I be rewarded for that? But Sarah, oh Sarah, was a thorn in my side that refused to be plucked. Every Sunday, I could feel her eyes on me, piercing through the facade I had so carefully built. She wasn't like the others. The rest of the congregation, bless their hearts, trusted me implicitly. They didn't question where the money was going or why the pastor who once drove a beat-up old Ford was now driving a Mercedes. They believed that God was blessing me because I was His servant, doing His work. But Sarah, she was different. She wasn't swayed by my fancy sermons or my polished appearance. No, she was after the truth, and the more questions she asked, the more paranoid I became. I started avoiding her, skipping the post-service handshakes where she usually cornered me. But that only made her more determined. I remember the day she came to my office. I was sitting at my desk, going over the church's finances, making sure everything looked legitimate on paper. There was a knock on the door, and when I opened it, there she was, Sarah, holding a stack of papers and a look of quiet determination on her face. "Pastor James," she said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "I think we need to talk." I felt my heart skip a beat. For a moment, I considered lying, telling her I had a meeting to attend, but I knew it wouldn't work. Sarah wasn't the type to be easily brushed off. I gestured to the chair in front of my desk, and she sat down, placing the papers in front of me. "I've been looking into the church's finances," she said, her voice steady. "I've noticed some discrepancies." The blood drained from my face. I quickly glanced at the papers, and sure enough, they were financial records. Some of them altered, others raw, exposing the truth I had worked so hard to conceal. She had found out. Somehow, she had gotten her hands on the real numbers, and there was no way to deny it now. "Discrepancies?" I echoed, feigning ignorance. "What do you mean, Sarah?" She didn't flinch. "I mean that there's a significant portion of the donations that aren't going to the causes you've been preaching about. The orphanage, the missionary trips, the outreach programs, none of them are receiving the money we've been collecting. Where is it going?" There it was. The question I had been dreading. The question that would unravel everything. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the papers, my mind racing. I could lie. I could come up with some excuse, some reason for the missing funds. But I knew that Sarah wouldn't buy it. She was too smart for that. She had the evidence, and no amount of smooth talking was going to get me out of this one. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on me. For years, I had been playing this game, skimming money from the tithes, living a life of luxury while my congregation believed they were supporting God's work. And now it was all coming to an end. "It's complicated, Sarah," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't blink. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, trying to figure out where to start. How do you confess to something like this? How do you explain to someone that you've been stealing from them, from God, for years? "I never meant for it to go this far," I began, my hands trembling. "When I first started the church, I was doing it for the right reasons. I wanted to help people, to spread God's word. But then the church grew, the donations started pouring in, and, I don't know, Sarah, I got lost in it all. The money, the power, the admiration. It changed me." Sarah's expression didn't soften. She wasn't here for an apology. She wanted answers. "So you took the money?" she asked bluntly. I nodded, shame washing over me. "Yes, I did. I used it for myself, for my lifestyle, my home, my car. I told myself it was just a little at first, that I would pay it back. But then, it became easier. It became normal." There was a long silence as Sarah processed my confession. I could see the disappointment in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged just slightly as the reality of my betrayal sank in. "You lied to all of us," she said quietly. "You used God's name to justify your greed." Her words cut deeper than I expected. I had known this day would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that I wasn't prepared for. "I know," I whispered, "and I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. I knew that. Sarah knew that. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologizing could undo it. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice cold and detached. What happens now? It was a question I had been asking myself for months. What would I do when the truth finally came out? Would I run? Would I fight it? Or would I finally face the consequences of my actions? "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know what happens next." Sarah stood up, gathering the papers and clutching them tightly in her hands. "I'm going to the church board," she said, her voice resolute. "They need to know the truth." Panic surged through me. "Sarah, please," I begged. "There has to be another way. I can fix this. I can make it right." But she shook her head. "It's too late for that, Pastor James. You had your chance. Now, it's time for the church to know the truth." I watched as she walked out of my office, the door closing softly behind her. And just like that, the world I had built, The life I had so carefully crafted began to crumble around me. In the days that followed, everything fell apart. Sarah went to the church board, just as she had promised. They were shocked, of course, devastated. Some of them couldn't believe it, didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. The financial records were clear. I had been stealing from the church for years, using their money to fund my own life while pretending to be their spiritual guide. The fallout was swift. I was removed from my position as pastor. The congregation, those poor, trusting souls, were told the truth. Many of them left the church, their faith in me, and perhaps in God, shattered. Others stayed, determined to rebuild, to find healing in the midst of the chaos I had caused. And as for me, I lost everything. My home, my car, my reputation gone. I was left with nothing but the crushing weight of my guilt and the knowledge that I had betrayed the very people who had trusted me the most. It's been months since then, and I've had a lot of time to think, to reflect on the choices I made, the lies I told. I've wondered how I could have let it get this far, how I could have become so consumed by greed and power that I lost sight of everything I once believed in. And now, as I write this confession, I realize that there's no redemption for me. Not in the eyes of the church, not in the eyes of the people I deceived, and perhaps not even in the eyes of God. I thought I could have it all, the money, the power, the admiration. But in the end, all I've been left with is the hollow shell of a life built on lies. This is my confession, the truth of who I am. And now, I must live with the consequences of that truth. I didn't sleep the night after Sarah walked out of my office. The weight of everything I had done pressed down on me like a mountain, suffocating me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, the faces of the people I had deceived, the people who had trusted me. I saw the Johnsons, who had tithed faithfully for years, even when they were struggling to make ends meet. I saw Mrs. Adams, a widow on a fixed income who gave more than she could afford because she believed in the work of the church. I saw young couples who had just started their lives together, handing over their hard-earned money because they believed it was going towards something bigger than themselves. They had all trusted me, and I had betrayed them. The next day, I didn't leave my house. I knew the news had spread. It wouldn't be long before the whole town knew what I had done. I sat in my living room, staring blankly at the wall, wondering how my life had come to this. By the evening, my phone was ringing off the hook. Calls from the church board, from members of the congregation, from reporters looking for a comment. I ignored them all. What was there to say? The truth was out. There was no point in pretending anymore. I couldn't hide behind my title, my sermons, or my facade of righteousness. I was exposed for what I really was, a fraud. It wasn't until the third day after Sarah's visit that I finally left the house. I couldn't hide forever, and part of me knew that I had to face what was coming. I drove to the church, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe a few people, maybe an empty building. What I found was worse than I had imagined. The parking lot was nearly full. Cars were lined up in rows, more than I had ever seen for a weekday service or even a meeting. As I stepped out of my car, I could see groups of people standing near the entrance, their faces somber, some of them looking angry, others just confused. And then they saw me. The murmurs started immediately. I could hear my name whispered in harsh tones. Some people pointed, others just stared, as if they couldn't believe that the man they had called pastor could be the same man who had stolen from them. My heart pounded in my chest, my stomach twisted with nausea, but I kept walking. There was no going back now. I reached the entrance of the church, and that's when I saw them, the church board standing together waiting for me. They were a group of men and women who had supported me from the very beginning, who had believed in me and my vision for the church. They had trusted me with their lives, with their families, with their faith. And now, they were the ones who had to face the aftermath of my betrayal. James, one of them said, "Mr. Harrison, an elder of the church," his voice heavy with disappointment. "We need to talk." I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. "I know." They led me into the sanctuary, and as we walked down the aisle, I couldn't help but notice how different it felt. The sanctuary, which had once been a place of warmth and comfort for me, now felt cold and empty. The stained glass windows, which had once seemed so beautiful, now cast long, haunting shadows on the floor. The pulpit, where I had once stood so confidently, now seemed like a distant memory. We sat down in the front pews, and the silence was deafening. No one seemed to know where to begin. Finally, it was Mr. Harrison who spoke first. "Why, James?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with pain. "Why did you do it?" I had no answer for him. Or rather, I had too many answers, none of which would ever be good enough. How could I explain that I had been driven by greed? That I had let the allure of money and power consume me? That I had justified my actions over and over again, telling myself that I deserved it, that no one would notice, that it was all for the greater good? I don't know, I finally whispered, my voice breaking. "I lost my way." Mr. Harrison sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The other board members sat in silence, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and sadness. These were people who had stood by me, who had believed in the vision of the church. And I had let them down. "The congregation is devastated, Mrs. Whitmore," another board member said softly. "Some of them don't even know what to believe anymore. They're questioning everything, whether the church was ever real, whether their faith meant anything." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always known that my actions would have consequences, but hearing them laid out like that, knowing that I had shaken the very foundation of people's faith, was almost too much to bear. "I never meant to hurt anyone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could control it. I thought I could make it right eventually." "You thought wrong," Mr. Harrison said, his voice sharp. "You've done more damage than you can imagine. People trusted you, James. They believed in you. And now, they don't know what to believe in anymore." I lowered my head, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He was right. I had spent years building a church, building trust, building faith, and in a matter of months I had destroyed it all. "I'm sorry," I whispered, knowing that the words were hollow, that they couldn't begin to make up for what I had done. But sorry wasn't enough. It never would be. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice shaky. I wasn't sure if I was asking them, or asking myself. "We've called an emergency meeting of the congregation," Mr. Harrison said. "We're going to tell them everything. They deserve to know the truth." I nodded. There was no point in arguing. The truth was already out, and the only thing left to do was face it. "And you?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. "What happens to me?" Mr. Harrison sighed, looking at the other board members before answering. "You're no longer the pastor of this church, James. That much is clear. We'll be seeking legal counsel to determine what happens next in terms of the money you took. There will be consequences, both for you and for the church." I had expected that answer, but hearing it still felt like a death sentence. I was no longer the pastor. I had lost everything. My title, my church, my identity. All gone because of my own greed and selfishness. "I understand," I said quietly, my voice hollow. The meeting didn't last much longer after that. The board members discussed the logistics of informing the congregation, the steps they would take to rebuild trust, and how they would begin to repair the damage I had caused. I sat there, listening, but I felt like I was somewhere else, floating above it all, disconnected from the reality of what was happening. When it was finally over, they asked me to leave the church property. I wasn't welcome there anymore, not as a pastor, not even as a member. I had betrayed them all, and there was no coming back from that. As I walked out of the sanctuary for the last time, I couldn't help but glance back at the pulpit. It seemed so far away now, so unreachable. It was the place where I had once stood, where I had preached with confidence and passion, where I had convinced myself that I was doing God's work. But it had all been a lie. The pulpit had become a stage and I had been playing a part. And now the curtain had fallen. When I got to my car, I sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, trying to figure out what to do next. My mind was blank. I had no plan, no idea where to go or how to fix what I had done. All I knew was that my life as I had known it was over, and I had no one to blame but myself. In the days following my dismissal from the church, everything around me started to unravel faster than I could have imagined. I had lost my position, my reputation, and my community. The congregation, who had once viewed me as a spiritual leader, now saw me as a charlatan, a wolf in sheep's clothing. I could feel their judgment wherever I went. I stopped going to the grocery store because I couldn't bear the way people whispered behind my back, how they averted their eyes, or even worse, stared me down with open contempt. The looks of betrayal were more painful than any words they could have said. I shut myself in my house, avoiding the world. Days passed in a blur, each one darker than the last. I spent my time pacing around the house, staring out the window, watching the seasons begin to change as my life crumbled in the space of a few weeks. The phone stopped ringing. The letters from the church board began to pile up on the kitchen counter, unopened. I already knew what they would say. Demands for restitution, discussions about legal actions, but I couldn't bring myself to face any of it. I was too deep in my own self-loathing. One evening, I sat in my living room, the light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. I had been drinking, a habit I had developed in the days following the scandal. It numbed the guilt, quieted the voices in my head that constantly reminded me of what I had done. The bottle was half empty, and I stared at it, wondering how much further I would fall before I hit rock bottom. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one came to visit anymore. My stomach churned at the thought of who it might be. Reporters? The church board? A member of the congregation come to confront me? I dragged myself to the door, opening it slowly, dreading the confrontation that awaited. But when the door swung open, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. It was Sarah. When I opened the door and saw Sarah standing there, a wave of conflicting emotions hit me all at once. Shame, anger, and a faint glimmer of hope that perhaps she had come to offer me a lifeline. But as I looked into her eyes, I knew that hope was misplaced. Sarah wasn't here to save me. She was here to finish what she had started. "Sarah," I croaked, my voice hoarse from disuse. "What are you doing here?" She stood on the threshold, her arms crossed over her chest, her face unreadable. The sun was setting behind her, casting her in shadow, but her presence alone was enough to fill the space with tension. "I wanted to talk," she said finally, her tone cool and direct. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, unsure of what she wanted from me. But what did I have to lose? My life was already in ruins. I stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. She walked past me, her movements stiff and deliberate, as if she didn't want to get too close, as if the air around me was toxic. We sat down in the living room, facing each other in uncomfortable silence. The house felt emptier than usual, the echoes of my past failures reverberating off the walls. I could tell she was studying me, watching for any sign of weakness or remorse. "Why did you come?" I finally asked, breaking the silence that felt like it had stretched for hours. Sarah didn't answer right away. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, her eyes never leaving mine. "I've been thinking about everything," she said, her voice soft but steady. "About you, about the church, about what happened. And I realized that I still don't understand why you did it." I opened my mouth to respond, but she held up her hand to stop me. "No," she said firmly. "I don't want excuses. I don't want another sermon. I want the truth, James. I want to know what was going through your mind when you took that money, when you lied to all of us. How could you do that to people who trusted you?" Her words stung, each one piercing through the layers of denial and self-justification I had built up over the years. I had been asked that question countless times in my head, but I had never really allowed myself to answer it. Not honestly. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my hands clasped together as if in prayer. The truth was ugly. It always had been. "It wasn't about the money at first," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was about control, power. I loved the way people looked at me, Sarah. I loved being the man they turned to for guidance, for answers. The pastor, the leader, the shepherd." I paused, my throat tight with emotion. I had never said any of this out loud before, not even to myself. But once I started, I couldn't stop. The money came later, I continued, my voice thick with shame. At first, it was just a little here and there. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was all for the good of the church. But then, it became about me, about what I could get out of it. The vacations, the cars, the suits. I convinced myself I deserved it because of everything I had done for the church. I glanced up at her, but Sarah's expression remained unchanged. She was listening, but I couldn't tell what she was thinking. I kept telling myself I'd stop. I said, my voice growing more frantic as the memories flooded back, that I'd pay it all back. But the more I took, the harder it was to stop. And the lies just kept piling up until I didn't even recognize myself anymore. Sarah finally spoke, her voice low and controlled. You didn't just lie to us, James. You used God's name to lie. You manipulated people's faith to get what you wanted. Don't you understand how deep that betrayal goes? I flinched at her words. Of course, I understood. I had been living with the weight of that betrayal every day since the truth came out. But hearing it from her, from someone who had once looked up to me as a spiritual leader, made it all the more unbearable. I know, I whispered, my voice breaking. I know what I did, and I hate myself for it. I hate that I became the very thing I used to preach against. Sarah shook her head, her disappointment evident in every movement. It's not about hating yourself, James. It's about the people you hurt. You didn't just destroy your own life. You shattered the faith of an entire congregation. Some of those people will never recover from what you did. Her words cut deep. I had been so focused on my own guilt, my own shame, that I hadn't truly considered the lasting impact of my actions on the people who had trusted me. My lies hadn't just ruined my life. They had shaken the foundations of their faith. I don't know how to make it right, I said, tears welling up in my eyes. I've lost everything, Sarah. The church, my reputation, my future. What more can I do? Sarah sighed, and for the first time since she had arrived, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Pity, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. She had been through a lot, too. She had been the one to uncover the truth, the one who had forced my hand. But that didn't mean she hadn't suffered because of it. There's no easy fix for this, James, she said softly. You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was. You have to live with the consequences of your actions. And that's not going to be easy. I nodded, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. I know. I'm trying. But I don't know how to move forward from here. For a moment, Sarah didn't say anything. She just sat there watching me, as if trying to decide whether or not to offer me some shred of hope. Finally, she spoke. Maybe the first step is to stop hiding, she said. Stop wallowing in your guilt and actually face the people you hurt. They deserve an explanation. They deserve to hear you admit what you did. The thought of standing in front of my former congregation, of facing the people I had betrayed, terrified me. I didn't know if I had the strength to do it. But deep down, I knew Sarah was right. I couldn't move forward until I faced the full weight of my sins. I don't know if they'll ever forgive me, I admitted. Maybe they won't, Sarah said, her voice matter of fact. But that's not the point, is it? The point is that they deserve the truth. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging between us. I didn't know if I had the courage to do what she was suggesting, but I knew it was the only path left for me. I'll think about it, I said finally, my voice hoarse with emotion. Sarah nodded, standing up to leave. As she reached the door, she turned back to me, her face softening for the first time since she had arrived. I don't know if there's redemption for you, James, she said quietly. But I do know that the man you were pretending to be, the man we all thought you were, he would have wanted you to try, and with that she was gone. For days I wrestled with this realization. How could I move forward if I couldn't forgive myself? How could I continue on this path of redemption if I was still trapped in the past? I tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. Every time I closed my eyes and tried to speak to God, all I could hear were the echoes of my own failures. How could I ask for forgiveness when I couldn't even forgive myself? One evening, as I sat alone in my small apartment, I decided to go through the stack of letters from the church board that I had been avoiding for months. I had been dreading this moment, fearing that the contents of those letters would only add to the weight of my guilt. I opened the first letter and began to read. It was from the church's lawyer, outlining the legal actions that were being taken against me. They were seeking restitution for the funds I had stolen, which wasn't surprising. I had expected this. But what struck me wasn't the legal jargon or the formal demands. It was the reminder of just how much money I had taken. Seeing the numbers in black and white brought it all back. The vacations, the luxury items, the life of excess I had lived while pretending to be a humble servant of God. I had stolen from them. I had stolen from people like Mrs. Johnson, who had given their money in good faith, believing it was going to further the work of the church. And instead, it had gone to fund my greed. I sat there for a long time, staring at the letter, feeling the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a physical burden. The guilt was suffocating, crushing me from the inside out. For so long, I had been trying to escape this feeling, trying to bury it beneath layers of good deeds and self-righteous justification. But now there was no escaping it. I had to face the truth. I had ruined lives. I had betrayed the trust of people who had believed in me, who had looked to me for guidance. And there was no amount of community service or volunteer work that could ever make up for that. That night, for the first time in months, I allowed myself to truly feel the full weight of my guilt. I didn't try to run from it. I didn't try to justify it. I just let it wash over me, overwhelming me with the magnitude of what I had done. And in that moment, I realized something. Forgiveness, whether from others or from myself, wasn't something I could earn. It wasn't something I could work for or buy back with good deeds. Forgiveness was a gift, a grace that had to be given freely. And until I was willing to accept that, I would never find peace. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. The guilt was still there, heavy and ever-present, but it didn't feel as suffocating as it had before. For the first time, I wasn't running from it. I was facing it, acknowledging it for what it was, a consequence of my actions. I wasn't sure what the road ahead would look like, but I knew one thing. It wouldn't be easy. Redemption wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. It was a process, a journey that would require patience, humility, and perseverance. I knew there were still legal battles to face, debts to repay, and people who might never forgive me. But I also knew that, for the first time in a long time, I was ready to take responsibility for my actions. I was ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. I began reaching out to the people I had wronged, not to beg for forgiveness, but to acknowledge the harm I had caused and to offer whatever restitution I could. Some people were willing to talk to me, others weren't. I respected their decisions, knowing that forgiveness was not something I had any right to expect. I also began working closely with Pastor Fields and the remaining members of the church to try and rebuild what had been lost. I wasn't looking to be reinstated as pastor, far from it. I had no desire to return to the pulpit, but I wanted to help in whatever way I could, even if that meant cleaning the floors or setting up chairs for services. It was humbling work, and at times, the shame of my past weighed heavily on me. But in those quiet moments of service, I found a strange sense of peace. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I wasn't trying to earn redemption or forgiveness. I was just trying to do what was right. Over time, I began to see small signs of healing, both in the congregation and in myself. The church, though smaller than it had been, was starting to rebuild. People were finding their faith again, not in me, but in something greater than any one person. And as for me, I was learning, day by day, what it meant to live with the consequences of my actions. I still didn't know if I would ever truly forgive myself, but I was beginning to understand that forgiveness, like redemption, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, a long, difficult journey that I would walk for the rest of my life. But for the first time, I wasn't walking that road alone. As I sit here, writing these words, I realize that my story isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. The road to redemption is long and winding, and there are days when I still feel the weight of my past pressing down on me. But I'm learning to live with it. I'm learning to accept that the man I was is not the man I have to be. I don't know if the people I hurt will ever fully forgive me. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive myself. But what I do know is this redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about acknowledging it, facing it, and choosing to move forward in spite of it. I'm no longer the pastor I once was. I no longer stand behind a pulpit, preaching sermons to a congregation. But in many ways, I've found something deeper, something more meaningful. I found the humility that comes from knowing how far I fell and the strength that comes from trying to rise again. And maybe that's what redemption really is. Not a grand moment of absolution, but a series of small steps, taken each day, toward becoming the person you were always meant to be. This is my confession. This is my truth. And this is the road I will walk for the rest of my life.